This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 7, Vietnam, with the section, the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive it took place in late January of 1968. And this was after, as the war is getting more unpopular, President Johnson and the American government promised the American people that the war is going well, that there is, an end in sight, that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are breaking, that American, technology and firepower and willpower are winning the day. But then in late January of 1968, a combined attack by the Viet Cong plus the regular army of North Vietnam infiltrated into South Vietnam and launched a simultaneous and massive attack on 27 South Vietnamese cities. And this made the American government look very foolish, that enemies that are near defeat do not launch coordinated, well-planned out, well-supplied attacks all over an entire country. And you can tell by the map that, the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attacks stretched from the north part of South Vietnam all the way to the very south part of South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, so named because it fell on Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, shattered these illusions. Now, militarily speaking, at first, the attack went off very well. There are communist troops in the streets of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. There are communist troops everywhere, it seems, and American forces kind of take a few days to kind of get their footing and, be able to counterattack. Now, while those few days are going on, as you can see like in the picture here, that this information, that from the very capital of South Vietnam, television pictures are being beamed back home of American troops having to fight in the streets of the capital of South Vietnam, it made the American people say, it added to the credibility gap. Our leadership is saying this war is almost won, and here we are desperately fighting defensively in the streets of the Vietnamese capital. Militarily speaking, it is a terrible defeat for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, that fully a third of all the Viet Cong fighters in all of Vietnam are killed by American and ARVN troops. After early successes, American superiority in fighting these kind of set-piece battles with tanks and artillery and men is overwhelming. The communist forces are forced to retreat, and they lose a huge chunk of their best forces. This is a military victory for the United States. But that no longer matters. And that is the difference between Vietnam and every other war that the United States had fought up until that time. The troops were successful, but it did not matter by then. Too many Americans already believed that the war was not winnable, because what they had seen on television, what they had read in the newspapers, the credibility gap that we talked about, even though the American soldiers, after a week or three, won an overwhelming military victory, in the minds of the American people watching their televisions, the war was no longer winnable. And then a trusted CBS news anchor made American victory impossible. In the late 1960s, I know this is a little hard to believe in today's day and age, but there's still only 3 major networks on television. Everything was NBC, CBS, ABC, and each one of those had a veteran newsman who would present the evening news at night, and many millions upon millions upon millions of Americans would tune in every night to their favorite news program. And it was reassuring that this guy that had been there forever is reading the news, presenting it. It's hard to imagine today, but in 1968, Walter Cronkite at CBS, Chet Huntley at NBC, and a young Peter Jennings at ABC, they were the voice of truth. That what they said was gospel. That you turned in, you watched your television, you watched Walter Cronkite on CBS, and by golly, that was the truth of the world. That Walter Cronkite could not possibly be biased. Walter Cronkite could not possibly have batted. It was Walter Cronkite, for goodness sake. It was as close to the voice of God as Americans would ever hear. Tens of millions tune in every night, and it's so, because nowadays we watch the news and our first reaction is, I don't know if I believe that. A lot of our news, a lot of young people especially, if they watch the news at all, watch satire shows like Jon Stewart. But in 1968, Walter Cronkite and NBC and CBS were fact. Cold, hard, solid fact. Cronkite is the most trusted of the group. He had a very grandfatherly voice. Here's a picture of good old... There's Walter Cronkite. And when he spoke, that was true. And for years, Walter Cronkite had reported the news that the war might soon be won, that he was accepting the same line that the government was giving to the New York Times, and then he took it from the New York Times, and it became the truth. But during the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite was giving his news broadcast, and he signed off by saying that there was no light at the end of the tunnel for the American mission in Vietnam. That the American mission in Vietnam was not close to success. It was not close to victory. In fact, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. President Johnson had been saying, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And Cronkite said, no, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And as soon as Walter Cronkite uttered those words, middle America, moderate America, abandoned the war. Pretty much. It changed President Johnson's approach to the war entirely. Escalation had been run from the White House, that the President and the Secretary of Defense had actually run the war. Instead of saying to the military, these are our political goals, now go achieve them through military means, Johnson and Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, sometimes meddled to the point where they would pick bombing targets, they would pick the amount of bombs that would be fallen, and stuff that is really best left up to professional soldiers. After Tet, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. military, decided to kind of tell the President what was reality. And they told the President that if they were going to win the war, they needed 200,000 more troops. Secretary of State Dean Acheson told Johnson that the military did not know what it was talking about and it could be ignored. The military said, no, we need 200,000 more troops. But whether they needed 200,000 more troops or not, 200,000 more troops, there was no way politically that the American government could send 200,000 more men to Vietnam with all of the unrest that was going on. The political situation just simply did not allow for 200,000 more men to be sent to Vietnam. There's already over 500,000. To increase that number by almost another 50% would make the anti-war demonstrations and the unrest in the United States even worse. So President Johnson reluctantly came to understand that victory was no longer possible, that the United States could not win the Vietnam War. So Johnson moved to attempting to prevent losing it, the war. He said he would not withdraw U.S. troops as long as South Vietnam was threatened by communist aggression. His goal became to force the communists to the negotiating table, to get them to give guarantees that they would not invade the South. He wanted political guarantees, diplomatic guarantees, that North Vietnam would not invade the anti-communist South. And in order to do this, what Johnson wants to do is maintain the highest possible level of military force, including bombing, while trying to negotiate a settlement from a position of strength. That if the United States can tell the North Vietnamese, we have all of these strengths left to us, you better come to the negotiating table, the Americans believe that that will force the North Vietnamese to negotiate. The North Vietnamese agreed to come to the negotiating table in 1968, and they began meeting in Paris, but they realized that time was on their side, that the American effort in Vietnam was at some point going to come to an end, and if they could just hang on, they would get everything they ever wanted. So although peace talks are decided, talks are held up for almost an entire year based simply on the shape of the negotiating table. whether it was going to be round or square or how big or who was sitting next to who. For almost a year, the North Vietnamese would not actually start talking because the North Vietnamese and the Americans and the Soviets and the Chinese were all involved, could not agree on the shape of the table. And all in that year, American troops kept dying, North Vietnamese troops kept dying, South Vietnamese troops kept dying by the tens of thousands all combined. The Americans wanted, again, guarantees for South Vietnam that they think they can enforce with their military might. The North Vietnamese know that the Americans are on their way out of Vietnam, and they just have to hang on. This was the situation that was in the works when Richard Nixon won the presidential election of 1968, and that would be the situation that he inherited his first day in office.